Welcome to my next episode, Great War Story. And this one I've called simply Measles, because my grandfather, when he was aboard the troopship Monganui, came down with the measles and was put into quarantine. And I'm sure you can appreciate, measles is bad enough as it is, but measles aboard a troopship could be a very serious thing indeed. Now, for the longest time, I didn't even know that he had had measles. And this was because of an oddity with the New Zealand archives, because there were two listings for records for my grandfather. And initially there was just the main one I'd looked at, that you see there on the right, and the other had written on it, at the time, duplicate file. So I had just assumed that it was exactly the same, and I never even bothered to open it. It was quite some time later where eventually I just looked at the duplicate file and realized that in fact it had a whole bunch of information that wasn't in the other one. So sometimes when you're researching a New Zealand World War One soldier, you need to look out for the fact that there could potentially be more than one file. And you can see down below, in fact, in terms of the physical inventory, that they're even held in different boxes, box 5 or box 113 in this case. And that also explains one of those puzzling things, because there are 140,000 military files that the New Zealand archives scanned, but there were not 140,000 people. I think it was closer to about 110,000 who actually had military files. So I assume those other 30,000 are, well, duplicate files of this nature. Now, when I opened some of that information, a lot of it was actually focused on his medical history. And this is where I learned that he had actually come down with measles. And you can see there he's on the troop ship Monganui, and there it is, the disease he was suffering from. He had been 30 days in hospital. Eventually, the next note says recovered, and it is signed by a fellow who's featured in a number of previous episodes, Ernest Thomas, his commanding officer. So I'm looking at this and thinking, goodness me, 30 days in hospital. Also knowing that measles among adult men can be a serious thing. I'm thinking, wow, I knew about his facial wound. I'd learned recently about his being wounded in the shoulder, which was also life-threatening. And here was another life-threatening thing that he lived through during World War One. Now, when exactly is this happening? Well, reconstructing what was going on in the voyage, the New Zealanders had crossed from New Zealand, and their first stop was Hobart in Tasmania. And from Hobart, they'd headed to a place called Albany in Western Australia. And in a previous episode, I talked about the death and funeral at sea of Lance Corporal Gilchrist, and that occurred about there on the 26th. The fleet arrived in Albany on the 28th, and so it was the following day, while they were still in the port, that Grandad was diagnosed with measles and put into quarantine. And we actually have a few photos of the fleet at Albany, because this is where there was a grand gathering of merchant ships. Not only the fleet from New Zealand carrying the New Zealand main body men, all of the Australian merchantmen who were going to be carrying the Australian Imperial Force were also gathering at Albany. They would set off together. So it was about 30,000 men on this grand convoy that was assembling at Albany. And as I said, I was thinking this must be pretty serious, and that's why I've got the Monty Python "Bring Out Your Dead" scene in the background of this slide. But I thought I'd better do some research to see just how serious measles was in military forces. So I found out that the Australian Imperial Force in the course of World War One lost over 100 men to measles. Apparently, it could be much more severe than that. In the US Civil War, Union forces are said to have lost over 4,000 men to measles. And the American forces in World War One, which confusingly were the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, not to be confused with the AIF, the Australian Imperial Force, they lost over 3,000 men in the Great War. And in fact, there wasn't an effective vaccine available until the 1960s. So measles, well, it was a serious thing, not to be sniffed at, not just like a common childhood disease as many people tend to think of it today. And then also evidence from New Zealand. Trentham Military Camp, which I think I mentioned at least once in a previous episode, was one of the major marshalling points for New Zealand troops gathering ready to go to war. Not so much the main body, but later groups of reinforcements were all sent there. And I found this description in a book called The New Zealand Medical Service in the Great War, 1914 to 1918. It commented that from November 1914, there was a notable increase in cases there. And then by May of 1915, the book was calling measles a full-on epidemic. And there was this quote: "The measles outbreak, at first of a mild nature, gradually increased in severity, until about midwinter it acquired an unusual virulence. Cases were described as being malignant. A suffocative type with septic bronchitis and a hemorrhagic type black measles were observed. It is, of course, open to argument that the last named cases were in fact meningitis, which broke out later." So, goodness me, my grandfather must have been suffering badly. And, well, there's the troop ship. It's carrying hundreds of men and an infectious disease aboard a ship packed with soldiers. This could be grim indeed. And the way you know this is my grandfather's ship is that number written on the side, HMNZT, His Majesty's New Zealand Transport number 3. That is the Maunganui. And what's particularly useful for historians who are researching this topic, that number only applies to the Maunganui on this voyage. Later on, when the Maunganui returns to New Zealand and takes fresh batches of reserves onwards to war, it gets a different number. So if you see number 3, it's not just this ship, it's this ship on this voyage. And fortunately for me, I actually managed to get some primary evidence from aboard ship. I've already quoted the Arari Tatler, which was a ship newspaper put together aboard the transport the Arari. And this is an example of a ship newspaper that was created on the Maunganui. It was called the Ocean Chronicle. And we even have, in this case, a notation of why it survives to the modern day, sent in by Major Waite, DSO, February 25th, Friday, 1921. And we have actually heard from this guy before. There's Major Waite, because he was the author of a book I cited in the last episode about the death of Jack Gilchrist. He was the author of The New Zealanders at Gallipoli. Now, I have a sneaking suspicion that he is actually the author of the Ocean Chronicle. Nowhere does it actually say who was behind it, but Fred Waite was actually a journalist working for a New Zealand newspaper before he joined up with the New Zealand Army. So I suspect that it was probably him who actually wrote it. And there was this note in the Ocean Chronicle: "Both hospitals on board seem to be well patronized, there being 7 in the infectious hospital, all of whom are looking very healthy, which goes to say much of the medical attention they are receiving." So I'm thinking, oh, hello, that's some information I didn't know before. 7 men. Well, they might all be measles cases, so there'll be my grandfather and 6 other men in this particular thing. Also learning that there were 2 different wards, one for, I guess, regular treatment, one for the infectious men. So I'm thinking, okay, doesn't sound quite as serious. They're not on death's door. But then there was something else in the Ocean Chronicle that completely changed my perspective. Here's what it said: "The patients in the infectious hospital are hoping that their period of isolation will last till the hot weather's over. The following poem gives vent to their feelings, and the poem is called Infectious Hospital Doggerel, and the author claims to be called H.E. Gordon of the New Zealand headquarters staff." Now, as you know, I like to chase down every last detail, and I looked through all of the military files of every soldier called Gordon who had a service number that could possibly apply to a man aboard the Maunganui in 1914, and I couldn't find anybody called Gordon who seemed to fit. So I strongly suspect that this is a nom de plume. There never was anybody called H.E. Gordon. Somebody else wrote it. And I haven't quoted the whole poem, but here are a number of verses from it. A subject choice is hard to find, but still I'll do my best. Infectious wards are on my mind and fill me with unrest. We had the measles long while back, but they've gone long ago. And what we're isolated for is what we want to know. We have a lazy time indeed, it sometimes makes me blush. Near all we do is drink and feed and smoke and sleep, but hush! We've landed in a comfy nest, in fact it's just a gift. To see us chaps at meal times, well, 'twould make you write a song. The way we clean the platters up, there can't be much that's wrong. But oh, the heat here is intense, we melt away like cheese. We're kept, the reason has some sense, for fear we spread disease. And suddenly my whole impression of what was going on with my grandfather changed. These guys don't sound like they're suffering at all. And in fact, when I went back and double checked it, what I learned was the dangerous period of measles is in the first week, but you get quarantined for 30 days. So if you make it through the first week okay, you feel quite miserable, I guess. It is potentially life-threatening, but for the following 3 weeks of your quarantine, you're actually feeling perfectly healthy. You're just not allowed out. Not at all what I had been thinking when I saw that he had been in hospital for 30 days. And there's one more verse I would like to share, because it's a little bit of extra insight into what life was like aboard the ship, and also for these men in the infectious ward. We're pestered much by footies bold, who come to get a shot. Get on the onions, we are told, and all that kind of rot. Potatoes, onions, turnips too, 'tis these we lie upon, and there we stay in sweltering heat until the men are gone. So the footies will just be the infantry, and the infantry will be coming in to get their vaccination shots. And so presumably there was somewhere else where they had to get the infectious men to go, so they sent them to go and lie on top of all the food supplies. Honestly, it doesn't really sound medically very sensible in terms of isolation. So the place where you were until very recently is where you're bringing in all of the other men to get their vaccinations. And meanwhile, you're told to go and sit on the food that the men are going to be eating shortly. Medically, probably not the best way to handle it. And a couple of other interesting things that you can note from the Ocean Chronicle. They had a couple of entries here called labour circles. We understand that the potato peelers have formed themselves into a union and are asking for smaller hours and larger potatoes. Their case will be heard at the next sitting of the arbitration court. And since there was no such thing as an arbitration court, that basically means never. It's just a humorous entry because a lot of the soldiers were being put to work in all sorts of different functions, and one of them was kitchen duty, peeling the spuds. And then there's another entry. The coal shifters union seems to be working on amicable terms with the employers. So there was also some quite hard labor because they were getting, well, let's not call them volunteers. They were getting voluntold that some of them had to go down and help shovel coal, which must have been hard and hot work as they were going through the tropics. And then there is a collection of letters that were written by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas. And I've been recently reading through them, looking for any entries that might help me with my research, and I found this. This letter will not be censored by our people. It'll be delayed at Colombo for about a fortnight and is liable to be censored by the postal authorities there, but I doubt whether they will take the trouble. So this was written while he was aboard the Maunganui, traveling between Australia and Sri Lanka, what they called Ceylon at the time. And also, as you can see, these letters are always subject to censorship. And it's a long letter. It's over 5 pages long. And later on in the letter, he wrote this. Webb practically dying. You may remember I mentioned the death of Lieutenant Webb. He was the one who dived into the shallow pool for the King Neptune ceremonies and snapped his neck. Webb practically dying. Total loss of horses up to date, 50, and 159 cases of measles. That's 159 cases of measles across all of the New Zealand troopships. I have 7. That matches what we saw in the Ocean Chronicle, that there were 7 men in the infectious ward, confirming that they were all measles cases. Nearly all the horses on board can be exercised round and round the ship. The headquarters staff horses exercised every day, the others take it in turns each afternoon. Now we're starting to get a clue about exactly why in the poem they're talking about being a bit lazy, having a good time, hoping that their period of isolation lasts while they're still in the tropics. Because aboard their ship, there's not just hundreds of men, there are 204 horses, and they all had to be cared for on a regular basis so that they would survive the journey. You can see already that Colonel Thomas mentioned they were getting a few deaths of horses. But overall, when they arrived in Egypt, actually British authorities were surprised by how few they had lost and how well they'd been treated. And one of the reasons was, well, they were given regular exercise all the time, as was noted by Colonel Thomas, but it must have been hard and brutal work. And my grandfather, as a driver, a private in charge of horses, would have had to have done that job every day, except for the fact, of course, that he was in the measles ward. And I would like to recommend one particular website for wonderful resources on World War I, mostly focused on Australia, but it has a few interesting ones relevant to New Zealand as well. It is the State Library of New South Wales. They have done a wonderful job of scanning sources, diaries, letters, and often even transcribing them, which makes them very easy to search. And it was there that I found the diary of William Sparks, a member of the Australian Imperial Force, and he was part of this grand fleet that set off from Albany in Australia aboard an Australian troopship called the Rangatira. And here's what he wrote about what it was like having to care for the horses. You hardly notice the time passing. The first parade's at 6:30 a.m. to feed horses, etc. After breakfast, we parade again at 8:30 to exercise horses, clean stalls, and hose out. Just now, we're well within the tropics and the heat is unbearable. It's not so bad on deck, but when you go below, you're in a indecipherable, I'm guessing, in purgatory, especially down on the stable parade where the air is full of ammonia. There is a walk made down where the stables are. It's the full length round the ship, and we walk the horses round there on matting. These mats are to be taken upstairs or rather on deck to be aired each day. This work in the hot air just about kills us. The horses are so far standing the trip well, and so are all the men on our ship. There's been a few ailing, but nothing serious. We have had to undergo another inoculation. I and others protested, but it was of no avail. They might have left it over till the cooler weather, which we would reach before the end of our destination, or rather trip. Some of the men have been very sick with it. I had only one bad day. One is not too well with the excessive heat without the inoculation rubbish. Our daily menu's still good, and everyone eating well. After the parade at 8:30, which I mentioned, we again fall in at 11:30 to feed the horses, dinner at 12 and fall in again at 1:30 p.m. Some do gun drill, others rifle exercises or other work. It's feeding time again at 3:30 and fetching up those dreadful heavy wet ammoniated matting strips. What's he talking about ammonia here? It's horse pee. Because, of course, horses just don't need to be exercised and walked and fed. Horses also poop and pee quite a lot. And that stink of ammonia comes from all of the horse piss. It was smelly, hard labor in hot tropical weather. And for 30 days, my grandfather did not have to do it. So, just to give you a sort of an overview of the general voyage. So they'd set out from Wellington in New Zealand, and their first port of call was Hobart. From Hobart, they travelled up to Albany in Australia, and it was between there that Jack Gilchrist died and was buried at sea. And it was while they were in Albany, of course, that my grandfather was diagnosed with measles and put in isolation. So then they had a long journey across the Indian Ocean up to Sri Lanka, and they stopped at Colombo. Now, that would have been a disappointment, I guess, for my grandfather because a lot of the troops were allowed off ship and were allowed to go and do a bit of sightseeing. Of course, he wouldn't have been allowed to do that. From Sri Lanka, they then crossed towards the Middle East and they stopped to coal at Aden. None of the troops were allowed off the ship in Aden, but they did at least stop at the port. And it was about a day out of Aden as they headed up the Red Sea that my grandfather would finally have finished his quarantine period. And then they eventually pass through the Suez Canal and disembark in Alexandria. So for that entire blue section of the voyage, my grandfather didn't have to do any of that hard labor. So it might seem a bit funny to call it lucky to catch the measles, but from one perspective at least, perhaps it was actually a good thing for him.